Alors, mesdames et messieurs, merci beaucoup.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. We're now going to try and establish a link with Edward Snowden. And then I'll be opening up a discussion with our guests. Ewen MacAskill, correspondent from The Guardian. Hubertus Knabe, who is a historian and a specialist of the history of the Stasi. And we're making this link that some of you may have linked between the American surveillance systems and other regimes. And then Sherif ElSayed-Ali, who is the deputy director in charge of international issues at Amnesty International, who plays a very important role in the organization of everything that is linked with Edward Snowden and all that's being done.
Alors,
Okay, so everything's working okay. We should be able to establish this link with Edward Snowden. We did a test earlier and it worked fine. And he said he had wonderful memories of Geneva. So that's a good sign.
Edward Snowden.
Edward Snowden, good evening.
D'abord, félicitations pour cet Oscar.
Congratulations on the Oscar. It's your Oscar as well, in a way. So I'd say we should give you a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Vous avez appris le français?
Thank you. Did you learn French in Geneva?
Désolé, je parle seulement.
Sorry, I only speak a little bit of French. There is this terrible moment in the film where we see that your life has gone from one life to another. Did you think that you were going to get out of it alive?
It's actually difficult to look back at that period and remember it clearly, because it was a period of so much tension, so much stress. We were all working together, myself and the journalists, to try to get as much of this information back to the public in the most responsible manner that we could. So we couldn't really think of anything else. For myself, I couldn't really think about tomorrow. Because the only thing that really mattered was today, was that moment, because we didn't know if there would be a knock at the door, if the door would be kicked open, or there would be a fire alarm and we would be forced to leave the room. We were all very fortunate that it ended as well as it did, and I think I'm incredibly fortunate for that, and the public is as well.
Vous avez l'air
You seem very normal, very balanced, Edward Snowden. Where did you find the courage to do all of this?
For me, it was not a question of of altruism, of courage. Could I be this hero and do the right thing, so much as we all have a level of incivility and inhumanity that we can see, that we can witness in our daily lives, that we can ignore. Whether it's a beggar on the street, whether it's a refugee in some difficult situation, where we feel like we can't fix all the problems in the world, so we can't let it trouble us too much. We turn away, we go about our lives, we keep walking down the street. But for me, this was a point where I realized I had spoken with my coworkers. I knew this bothered everyone. Everyone knew it was a problem, but everybody was afraid of the consequences. However, for me, for myself, I was one of the only people who had both an awareness of what was going on and the capacity to do something about it. So it wasn't a question of courage, but of necessity. And I think, you know, it's surely whenever anyone does something that's risky, they make some mistakes. They could do it better. I'm not perfect, but I'm glad that I tried.
Julian Assange. Julian Assange nous recevait à l'ambassade d'Équateur à Londres dimanche dernier. Il disait s'il est extradé aux États-Unis, évidemment il craint la peine de mort.
Of course, he's afraid of the death penalty, but he's also afraid of being cut off from everybody, put in a very secret place and sort of buried alive. Is that something you're afraid of if the American authorities catch you?
Yes, the laws that Julian Assange is threatened with in the United States are very similar to the laws that I myself have been threatened with. They're old laws that were originally passed to prevent dissent against the United States involvement in World War I. At the time, the U.S. was a more neutral, more isolationist. When they were trying, there were draft resistors who were agitating to the involvement in the war. Unfortunately, the law was so.
Alors, nous avons une difficulté de liaison.
Many years.
Peut-être qu'en régie, je vous propose qu'on essaie de rétablir la liaison. Et en attendant cela, question à vous, question d'abord à vous qui représentez Amnesty International. Aujourd'hui, beaucoup de gens se demandent que faire pour aider Snowden. Vous le faites.
Help Edward Snowden. Now you are helping him on a daily basis. What's going to happen next?
So, I mean, Edward Snowden is, you know, without doubt a whistleblower who I mean, he is someone who should be protected for exposing programs that violate human rights. We don't believe he should be charged for exposing the things that he has exposed. He shouldn't be under these threats in the United States. And certainly, governments who could extend protection to him, who could offer him asylum or you know, allow him even to just travel there, including in Switzerland, including in other European countries, should definitely do that. So, you know, the first thing that you can, you know, something that everyone can do, if you can, write to your representative, write to your, you know, prime minister, president, member of parliament, wherever you live, ask them to do this. Ask them why they are not offering protection to someone who has exposed such human rights violations.
Il y a eu ces promesses du ministre américain de la Justice.
There were promises from the American Justice Minister who said that they would give him a fair trial if he went to the United States. Do you believe that?
I mean, I think it's, you know, the point, and you know, obviously, you know, from this perspective, it's not whether the trial is fair or not. I mean, obviously that is essential, but at the same time, should he even be tried? Should he even be charged with these things? And we don't believe he should be, because what he did was expose government overreach, was expose things that should not be happening. And without people like him, without whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, we would be in a much worse situation.
Ewen, vous êtes dans le film. Il y a ce moment assez étonnant quand on vous voit prendre connaissance déjà de l'identité.
You are in the film, and we see how surprised you are when you first understand who Edward Snowden is. At that time, did you imagine this was such a huge scandal?
Could I just echo the point? Edward Snowden's applied to 21 European countries for asylum, and not a single one has granted him asylum, which I find disgraceful. They're so frightened of America that there isn't a single government, not Switzerland or Sweden or Germany, prepared to do that. On the second point, if Edward Snowden, the Justice Minister said that, he said this week, the American Justice Minister said that if Edward Snowden was to return to America, there would be due process. Now, what the Americans mean by that, under the Espionage Act, he would be tried only in front of a judge. He wouldn't be entitled to a jury. Edward Snowden's prepared to go back to America and stand in front of a jury, but not a judge. If you can imagine, in America, almost any judge is going to find them guilty. And it's not 30 years he's looked at, there's probably a lifetime in jail. So when the US Justice Ministry talks about due process, it's not what we mean by it. When I met Edward Snowden, it was just another assignment for me. I didn't think it was a big deal. And suddenly I found myself in the middle of the biggest story I'll probably ever do. I didn't think that 18 months, 2 years on, we'd still be talking about it. The night before the first story was published, it was a Verizon story. I was talking to Glenn Greenwald, and Ed was saying he thought this was a big story, and Laura thought it was a big story. And myself and Glenn weren't so sure. We were wondering if would it be on the front page of The Guardian. Was anybody going to pay any attention, even if it was? And we were completely shocked when as soon as the story was published. It hit a nerve. It was something that people had maybe been, it was something that was in their subconscious, but they hadn't really realized before. And when the Verizon story went out, wow, everybody picked it up, American media all around the world. When the second story went out on PRISM, just colossal, and it carried on that way. And then when Ed went public, it's just run ever since.
Voilà, nous devrions pouvoir entendre à nouveau.
Well, I think we can hear Edward Snowden again. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I apologize. We're having some technical trouble. Let's hope it's not the NSA.
Le ministre de la Justice américain a fait des promesses. On en parlait tout à l'heure. Est-ce que vous croyez qu'un procès honnête pour vous est possible aux États-Unis?
Do you think it's possible to have a fair trial in the United States for you?
I've been working very hard with my lawyers for quite some time now, since 2013, to try to get reliable guarantees of a fair trial in the United States. But unfortunately, the Department of Justice in the United States has been unwilling to agree or to make any kind of sort of agreements in that regard. The only thing they have said at this point was that they would not execute me, which I think that's something that would make everyone feel a little bit more comfortable if they heard it. But that's not quite the same thing as agreeing to a fair and open trial. We don't want secret presentations of evidence. We don't want secret witnesses. We don't want secret interpretations of law. And on these points, the government hasn't really been willing to compromise or discuss them at all.
Vous avez toujours dit « Je suis un patriote ». Est-ce que vous voulez retourner aux États-Unis? Est-ce que le but pour vous est de retourner aux États-Unis?
Absolutely. I've said this consistently because, for me, patriotism is not a question of love for government. Patriotism is about loving your country. Patriotism is about loving your people and trying to do what's best for them, and to remember that it's not about agreeing that your government is right no matter what decisions they make, because governments are often wrong. And people who truly love their country, people who truly support their country, are the ones who stand up and say when things are going wrong, and they try to put them right. So, yes, it's not that I've ever sought to be anti-American or bring down my government. I don't think that's appropriate. And even in foreign countries as well. There were some discussions, for example, in Switzerland, about investigating the policies and programs of sort of the NSA and the CIA and their activities in Switzerland, many of which at this point are known to have broken the law. But these decisions in Switzerland often have to come from the level of the Federal Council. You know, it's a political decision. They have to agree not to interfere with the case, which unfortunately in some previous CIA incidents did not happen. They did interfere with the administration of sort of an independent pursuit of justice, what the federal prosecutor sought to do. But that doesn't mean, you know, allowing an independent investigation of criminal activities, even if they're only suspected, is not to be anti-American or anti-Chinese or whoever is the accused. It's to be fair and to recognize that laws are important, that a fair playing field is important, and that we can't, even in the case of great powers, allow one sort of superstate, one great power, to play by different rules from all of the other states. When we start creating exceptions in that regard, particularly in the context of violations of rights, violations of laws, even in neutral countries, we're creating a very dangerous playing field that I think is contrary to the interests not only of Switzerland, but to the world.
En Suisse, vous avez compris beaucoup de choses.
It's true that you've understood a lot about Switzerland, and you show the extent to which Switzerland was a real capital for surveillance and spying. Is that still the case?
It is. I mean, I don't have current classified information, of course. I no longer work there, but the things that made Switzerland so interesting as sort of an espionage capital, particularly Geneva, haven't changed. It's still the international headquarters for the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, International Committee of the Red Cross. It has representatives of foreign governments and holds embassies and international organizations, civil rights organizations, non-governmental organizations, human rights organizations from around the world in a single city. You've got tremendous flows of capital and money in Zurich. You have strong representation of bilateral international exchanges in Bern. So Switzerland, I would say, is of course, still has an active, at least U.S. Espionage presence. And I think that's true of many other countries as well. And unfortunately, this isn't a question so much of, does Switzerland need to create much stricter laws, create some sort of broad and extraordinary powers to spy on more people themselves, because it's not a question of relative power. It's a question of pursuing bad behavior when you have suspicion, you know, reasonable cause to suspect it, and enforcing the rules that are already on the books. Espionage is illegal in Switzerland. You don't need a new law. You don't need a new authority to say that. You simply need to investigate the instances that you find and follow them to their ultimate course and pursue an investigation fairly without regard to who it is who's accused of the wrongdoing in the first place.
Quand vous étiez agent ici à Genève,
when you were an agent here in Geneva, were you afraid of Swiss counter-espionage, or were you entirely free in the way in which you worked?
No, yeah, not at all. The Swiss services were not considered a real significant threat in the same way, for example, the French services were. The French are known for being very sophisticated, very aggressive, and very professional. The Swiss services are also highly competent, highly professional, but they are also small and in many ways co-opted. Switzerland portrays itself as neutral in international relations, and in many cases this is true. Unfortunately, in the context of intelligence, that's not quite the case. I don't want to speak with any specificity to any particular allegation or controversy, because it should not be up to me to decide what information should be public or not public. That's a question for institutions of the press to decide. However, I think it's well established at this point. There have been CIA operations in Switzerland, CIA agents who are involved in weapons of mass destruction cases and things like that, people who are involved in nuclear proliferation, who were involved in extraordinary violations of law in Switzerland, in Germany, and the surrounding regions. And unfortunately, there was political influence in those cases, and it went to the highest levels of government. And this is the reason that representatives of the American government, even when they're violating laws in Switzerland, have a level of comfort that there won't be any consequences, there won't be any repercussions. Because at the end of the day, no matter how serious the crime, no matter how serious the allegation, a government in the host country, Switzerland in this case, but this happens all around the world, it's not a specific criticism of Switzerland, has to be willing to say that this powerful government will be held to account for its actions. And that is a frightening thing to do for a smaller country that's quite dependent on foreign relations. And I think until that dynamic is addressed through Swiss policy or politicians, we're going to see more and more of that in the future. It's the same in the case of, for example, when I applied for asylum throughout Europe. Swiss politicians, you know, if you canvassed them and said, do you think that this particular individual, not necessarily me, but any individual who revealed serious wrongdoing, serious crimes, and the public needed to know about this, should they be entitled to some protection? Most ordinary people, most rank and file politicians would say, yes, of course. You know, if I were Chinese and I were reporting about Chinese violations of Swiss citizens' rights, it would be no question. But if I'm an American and you're asking very senior politicians, they may have different answers.
Quelle est votre situation, Edward Snowden, actuellement?
Edward Snowden, what is your current situation? The United States have cancelled your passport, is that correct?
Yes, I was en route to Latin America to seek asylum in Ecuador. But unfortunately, as soon as I departed Hong Kong, the U.S. received notice and they canceled my passport, which locked me in place in Russia. I never chose to be in Russia. It was kind of forced on me by these activities. And while I was in the airport in Russia, I applied for asylum in 21 different countries around the world, the majority of which were in Western and Central Europe. Unfortunately, no European country at all said they were willing to provide asylum. And so I remained.
Quel autre sanctuaire est possible? Vous ne
So
pouvez pas
where
rester
else could you go?
indéfiniment
You
en
can't
Russie.
just stay
Quel
in
autre
Russia
sanctuaire est
forever.
possible?
So where else might you be able to go?
Well, it seems quite likely, if we're speaking just in practical terms, that I will never be allowed to leave Russia by my government. You know, the United States certainly does not wish to see me travel. It is quite possible, you know, any day, any European government could stand up and say, we're no longer willing to agree to this sort of policy of exile. And I would love to return to a place like Switzerland. Some of my favorite memories actually are from Geneva. You know, even just walking around down the
Vous faites des heureux dans la salle.
You're making a lot of people very happy here in the room.
Thank you.
Vous savez,
Really, it's my
pardon,
pleasure, but
Edouard,
it's a wonderful place.
un certain nombre de gens
Edward,
aimeraient
do you know
faire
that
venir
a lot
comme
of people would
réfugiés
probably like to
politiques
have you here
en
as a
Suisse?
political refugee
Sérieusement,
in
est-ce que c'est
Switzerland?
une hypothèse qui
Seriously, is that a
est intéressante
possibility
pour vous?
for you? Would you be interested in
Le
that
fait que ce soit un
possibility?
pays neutre au centre de
Since it's a
l'Europe,
neutral
est-ce que ce serait
country
intéressant?
in Europe, would that be good for you?
I do think Switzerland would be a great sort of political option because of their historical neutrality, because of sort of the involvement in the past. It would allow Switzerland to politely assert that neutrality matters, that rules matter, that rights matter, and that the defense of our liberties matter. At the same time, they couldn't be accused of taking some kind of anti-American activity like other governments are commonly accused of. And I think that would be, you know, it would be something that would be acceptable to the United States, despite what they might proclaim publicly, and to other countries around the world. But ultimately, that's not a decision, you know, for me or the American government or anyone else. That's a discussion for the citizens of Switzerland to have with their politicians and the Federal Council.
Barack Obama a dit que vous n'étiez pas
Barack
patriote.
Obama said that you were
Qu'est-ce
not
que
a
vous lui
patriot.
répondez?
What would you reply to him?
It's okay to have those disagreements. You know, I'm not going to tell the President of the United States what he should or should not think. That's arrogant, and I think unfair. Certainly, he may have a different opinion from where he sits. But now, 2 years on from when those accusations were leveled against me, we can judge things not on the basis of emotions, not on the basis of names, but on facts and on history. He said these things because he said, I had made my country and countries around the world less safe, that I was going to cost lives, that American servicemen were going to die, that I would have blood on my hands. And, you know, if you look back at June 2013, it was a scary time. No one knew what happened, you know. They thought I was a Chinese spy, and they thought I was a Russian spy. You know, then God knows what they say about me now. But when we look at it, we can judge those claims and go, in fact, we're safer today than we ever have been before. Rather than having military casualties of the U.S. military increase, they've decreased and are lower now than they were in 2013. We haven't seen, you know, extraordinary attacks go off. In fact, every recent terrorist attack that's occurred, these individuals were known to intelligence services beforehand, and rather than being a question of these mass surveillance programs stopping them, we see that wherever there have been mass surveillance programs, these attacks have gone through frequently because, as it was in the case of Charlie Hebdo in France, they said they didn't have the resources to continue monitoring these individuals. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And I would argue, we don't know for sure, and it will take many years before we really know, but mass surveillance programs that monitor all of us electronically are incredibly expensive. They require science and research and very expensive computer-based programs that require changes in law that demand attention from parliamentarians, from lawmakers, from lawyers throughout society to get these laws drafted and passed. And these are resources that could have been applied elsewhere. They could have been applied to the traditional, old-fashioned methods of police investigation that we know do work, that we know do stop terrorist attacks, and that we do know are effective, unlike these unproven methods of mass surveillance. And remember, you don't have to take my word for that. In the wake of 2013, in the United States, the White House, or the president, appointed 2 independent review panels that had full access to secret information, to classified information, who could interview all of the heads of the intelligence services and get you know, the version of the story that they won't tell us, and say, are these programs effective? Are they efficient? And the results of both of these panels found that mass surveillance, despite having occurred for 10 years in the United States, had never stopped a single terrorist attack. So the question is, why do we continue putting money and people and resources into programs that we know are not effective, that we know do not make us safe? And when you look at that allocation of resources, it's possible that they're actually making us less safe.
Est-ce que vous mettez encore de l'espoir en Barack Obama?
Do you still have hope in Barack Obama during the second part of his term of office? Some have lost faith in him, but others say that he still can do something. Are you still hopeful in terms of your personal situation?
I try not to focus on me, because ultimately what happens to me doesn't matter. You know, it sounds callous to say that. But regardless of what you think of me, whether you think I'm, you know, this great hero or whatever, or whether you think I'm a terrible traitor, I was only the mechanism of revelation. Ultimately, the people who have pushed this forward are our institutions of the press, our newspapers, our activists, our lawyers, our ordinary citizens who said that these issues matter, that our rights matter, we need to do something about it. So when we put this in the context of the president, for me, it's not about will he do something about me. It's a question of will he do something about us. The president in the United States today has the power, without any changes in law in the United States, of picking up his pen and ending the program that right now creates records of the phone calls of every American citizen. That's 330 million people whose private records are being intercepted, stored, and analyzed, despite the fact that they're not suspected of any criminal activity. He could end that today. He could end that tomorrow. He could end that next week. And I think, for the benefit of all of us, it would send a moral message not just to the people of the United States, but the world, to say, we have tried this, we have reviewed it, we have measured these programs, and found they were a mistake. We won't make these mistakes again, and we're swearing off these policies just like we found that torture was an effective policy, just like it was an inexcusable policy, and reminding the world that even if these programs were effective, even if they did stop crimes in some narrow sense, giving up the rights of everyone in society to stop a few rare crimes is not a fair trade-off, and it's not part of the American value system.
Est-ce qu'à votre avis, est-ce que les programmes de surveillance de masse ont été
These mass
révisés?
surveillance programs, have they been changed? Have they been reviewed?
Des promesses qui sont déjà passées?
Or are these just empty promises?
They have been reviewed. They have not been changed in any substantive manner. There have been a few small policy changes where they say, yes, we will continue to collect all of your information. If you're a foreign citizen, you don't have any legal protection that says we're going to spy on you any less. However, when we're publishing reports about what you did, we'll black out your name if it's not important, things like that. So they'll know you work at this company, they'll know what product your company is producing, they'll know who you sell it to. They'll know, for example, who your friends are, who you sleep with, where you go, who you talk to on the phone. But they'll say those aren't the important parts of this report, so we'll just say which parts we're interested in. This is better than nothing, but unfortunately it's still a very serious violation of our rights.
Beaucoup sont frappés en voyant le film à quel point il y a des comparaisons avec des pratiques totalitaires. Est-ce qu'il y a selon vous une vraie tentation totalitaire de la NSA, du système américain?
In the American system and the NSA?
This is a complicated question because it requires a lot of nuance. I think when you get a system of government that begins to think about the ends, the ultimate results of their activities, as opposed to the road they walk to get there, we run a risk of ending up in very bad situations, regardless of the original intention. I don't think the people who work at the National Security Agency are bad people. I don't think they want to hurt anybody. I don't think they want to violate your rights. And I know this for a fact because I was one of them. I sat among them. I talked to them about it. And they had the same concerns that I do and that you do. However, they also think they're powerless to change it because these decisions are happening at a much higher level. And at the same time, the results of these activities are good. You know, they say if we can stop an attack, it's all worth it, even if we haven't stopped an attack on this basis. But this is really the challenge, is recognizing that people with good intentions can do very dangerous things, can do very bad things without realizing it. And it's for this reason that it's so important internationally that we remove it from questions of nationality. We remove it from questions of competition. And we think about not whether or not a particular program is legal, not whether it's lawful, but whether it's right and whether it's moral. And in this context, it doesn't matter whether or not this is lawful any more than it matters whether or not slavery is lawful. We can look at the impact of these activities. We can look at the costs of these activities and say, regardless of what some letters say on a page, these programs are wrong and they need to end.
Qu'est-ce qui est humainement le plus dur pour vous?
Humanly speaking, what is the most difficult thing for you today? Being in exile, you're suffering a lot of pressure. Personally, what's the most difficult thing for you?
Recognizing that I can't go home again. I mean, exile is an ancient and really sort of reviled circumstance. It's not something that happens too much anymore. And typically these things don't last forever. But increasingly we're seeing cases where if it's a great power who has been embarrassed, they can assert force in sort of new and lasting ways. But as much of a price as I've paid, you know, I can't see my family as regularly as I could. I can't see my friends, my coworkers, my colleagues. I can't do the work that I enjoyed and felt like I could make a difference with. And I can't see my home again. I don't feel like I've lost. I don't feel like, you know, I live in depression. In fact, I'm energized, I'm encouraged, and I look forward to waking up every day. Because despite the things that I've lost, I now have an opportunity to contribute and wake up every day recognizing that whether or not I win or lose, I tried. I tried to make a difference, and in some small way, I think maybe I did.
Il y a ce moment extraordinaire dans la...
There's a tremendous moment.
Dans la cérémonie des Oscars, il y a ce moment extraordinaire quand quelqu'un fait le jeu de mots entre raison et trahison. Je crois que ça vous a fait rire vous-même. L'humour, ça me frappe chez vous, hein, Edward Snowden. Vous arrivez encore à en avoir dans la situation où vous êtes.
Have a sense of humor in spite of your situation at the moment?
Yeah, there were the majority of people who saw the comment felt some sense of outrage about it. They felt it was sort of an unforgivable insult. But for me, seeing it personally, I think we have to keep a sense of humor about these things. And nobody can be beyond criticism. You know, I don't want people to think like they should walk on eggshells around me. I want to be criticized. I want to be scrutinized, because that's the standard that everybody who has some voice should have. I don't want you to trust what I say. If I make some allegation about something that's happening, I want you to demand evidence. And when somebody says, you know, I think you're a traitor, I think this was treason, I say, you know, that's okay. My country was born from an act of treason. We were originally a colony of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom. And if it wasn't for people who were willing to stand up and break the law, my country and its values would not exist. So there's a famous quotation that says, if this be treason, then let us make the most of it. And I think that's all that needs to be said.
Quel était votre rêve, Edward Snowden? Quand vous êtes entré au service de la CIA, vous saviez bien que vous n'entriez pas au service d'une chorale. Il y avait quand même une motivation, un rêve qui a été déçu visiblement. Qu'est-ce que c'était?
But what was your dream originally?
The idea of intelligence is not what it is. Intelligence gathering is not what it is in the movies. You know, it should never be sort of these James Bond fantasies of breaking into buildings and assassinating people, you know, burning down buildings or bases or whatever. Really, it's about protecting societies, protecting civilizations, protecting communities, not by sort of these outrageous acts of criminality, but rather finding the truth and being willing to speak that truth to the most powerful members of your government to ensure that their policies are in line with the facts. And this is really the greatest tragedy of the post-September 11th period, after the terrorist attacks in my country, was the policies of our government in many ways became divorced from facts. We started a war on the basis of false information that the most senior officials in our government knew was false, but they knew it was also persuasive. And when they wanted to start a war, they found that they had a mechanism to do so by misleading the public of my country and misleading the public of societies around the world. And that is something that it is the job and the responsibility of intelligence officers around the world to prevent. So when people ask me, did I sort of go back against the ideas that I held when I first went into the intelligence community, I would say no. In fact, that's precisely the opposite. What I did in 2013 was I stood up for the values of intelligence officers around the world and the mission that we were charged by our countries to perform, which is to tell the truth, despite the costs and despite the risks.
Est-ce qu'une autre vie est possible après tout ça?
Is another life possible after all of this?
I hope so. You tell me.
Laquelle?
What kind of life would that be
après une aventure pareille?
after such an adventure?
For now, I mean, I'm so invested in trying to move forward with the technological community, with colleagues in computer science research, anonymity research, to find methods where we can protect our communications around the world. And when we think about this in legal terms and lawful terms, it's quite difficult, because you can pass, for example, the best privacy laws that history has ever seen in Switzerland, or Germany, or France, or Italy. But as soon as your communications cross the border electronically, they're subject to different laws, and those changes in laws will be exploited. The term that I use to describe this is jurisdictional arbitrage, but it doesn't really matter. That the result is that laws can only protect our communications. They can only protect our private lives within the borders of our own countries. If we want to protect the human rights of people, not just within our country, but around the world, protect the rights of people in China, in Africa, in Russia, in Iran, in North Korea, in Latin America, even in the United States, that can only be done if it happens on the level of systems that every country around the world relies on. And so that's what my focus is on today, and I think would be my second act if we were to declare one.
Edward Snowden,
Edward Snowden,
si vous êtes réfugié politique en Suisse, qu'est-ce qui vous manque dans la vie quotidienne aujourd'hui? Vous êtes en exil dans la vie normale telle que vous pouviez l'avoir à Genève ou ailleurs. Qu'est-ce qui vous manque aujourd'hui?
What do you miss most about everyday life?
You know, there's this incredible atmosphere in Geneva that is, I think, quite unlike many other cities around the world, many other countries around the world, in that there are people of so many conflicting values. There's so much diversity, but they all find ways to put it down and come together, to live together, and to create sort of this thriving an interlocked society, where when you're walking around, you know, Lake Geneva and the Fête de Genève or something like that, watching the fireworks, and you look to the people to your left and your right, they're speaking different languages, their skin is different colors, but you can feel that you're all part of the same world, you're all part of the same humanity, and that's something beautiful, and I miss that a lot.
Vous êtes aux yeux de certains Américains un traître, d'autres
You're a traitor for some Americans.
Vous êtes
Others
tellement
support
américain,
you.
Edward Snowden.
But you are so American,
Est-ce que
Edward
la
Snowden.
logique des États-Unis n'est pas forcément impériale? Est-ce qu'il y a une tentation forcément de domination du monde des États-Unis? Ou est-ce que ça peut changer?
Do you think that might change?
I think we're beginning to see a turning away from the idea that the United States should sit on top of the world and dictate the outcome of every decision in every society, because those are the politics of conflict. And while they may work, while they may be profitable, and while they may be politically beneficial to certain classes of people, to certain members of the elite, they're not good for societies. And I don't mean this in terms of sort of just the international community, because although the world might agree with that, most Americans would not. I think it's bad for Americans as well. Ultimately, if we pursue politics that are not minimizing the level of conflict around the world, but are instead risking conflict by creating muscular, aggressive policy positions to every controversy around the world, that's inevitably going to lead to an increase in violence and an increase in tension that's to nobody's benefit.
Edward Snowden, merci. Vous nous avez accordé déjà plus de temps que ce qui était prévu.
Edward Snowden.
Je suis sûr que beaucoup de gens à la salle auraient envie de faire un vœu pour vous. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut vous souhaiter?
What could we wish you?
Well, I think for tonight it would just be good evening. Thank you so much.
Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Voilà, merci beaucoup d'avoir suivi
much,
cette discussion.
this discussion.
Nous la poursuivons avec nos invités, si vous le voulez bien. Hubertus Knabe, je suis sûr que beaucoup ici ont été frappés en voyant le film, même ceux qui sont sceptiques, disons, sur l'étendue de la tentation totalitaire, disons, de la NSA, de voir l'accumulation de ces informations qui forment une toile, comme certains régimes totalitaires en avaient l'ambition. Vous avez travaillé sur la Stasi, vous êtes spécialiste reconnu de ces questions-là. Quel lien on peut faire sans forcer l'histoire, sans exagérer?
Exaggerating. What link do you make with the situation in the Stasi?
Je suis historien, mais I wanted to speak in English. Okay, I'm historian, but when I saw the film of Laura, sometimes I thought I'm coming from the future. Because in the prison where I'm working now, it was a central prison of the secret police in East Germany, I can see every day where a state of surveillance can end. How people can be persecuted because of all these collected information. That they are not only arrested because of doing something, but they are surveyed already in advance. And as the head of the State Security Service in East Germany always said, we must know who is who. That's the main question. We must know who is who to hinder them to act. And this is very similar to this what we watched now on this film, that the NSA wants to know who is doing what. But there's also a big difference, of course, that nobody's arrested. We can discuss here, we can leave this discussion, and there's no secret police officer outside of this building. And then we can be very grateful for that. But that's, for me, the reason that we have to defend the democracy and the freedom of the personal sphere of everybody. And if surveillance is necessary, and sometimes it's necessary, if we think, for example, of what happened in Paris some weeks ago, it would have been better to tap them before they could act like that, the terrorists there. But we must be very cautious what we are doing. It's a very dangerous instrument, these methods of surveillance, and we have to do it under the control of the law, of the justice, which must be independent, and of course also under the control of the freely elected parliaments. And what we saw this night, it's not the case now, unfortunately. And that makes also, on the place where I'm working, it's a memorial to explain the surveillance state of East Germany. Sometimes it becomes very difficult to explain people this fundamental difference between democracy and the totalitarian dictatorship, and that's really a pity.
Ewen MacAskill,
Ewen MacAskill.
On parle beaucoup des États-Unis. Les services de renseignement britanniques comptent énormément dans ce système. Est-ce que quelque chose change de ce point de vue-là? Ou est-ce que l'alliance est toujours aussi parfaite entre les Britanniques et les Américains?
Still as strong as ever between the UK and the US?
Before I answer that, I met Edward Snowden in Hong Kong. I met him in Moscow last year. I've been in discussions with him on chat lines and Skype and whatever. That was quite a remarkable interview. He's very seldom as relaxed as that. He doesn't like talking about his personal life. So that was a completely naked appeal to Switzerland to give him asylum. I was surprised to see him as open as that. He's usually too polite to make such a direct request. I think after he ended up in Russia, there was talk about maybe Switzerland being the natural home for Snowden, and then nothing happened. I don't know what happened to the discussions here. But if you watch Snowden, as I said, I've been watching him for almost 2 years now, and I've never heard him being as personal and open as that. So he's asking for your help. He wants to come back to Geneva. It was pretty obvious from that interview.
At this point, that's so tragic, I think, that he got the asylum in a state where democracy isn't existing and where the secret police is playing such an important role that the former head of the secret police is now the president. So that's the tragedy of him.
You heard during Citizenfour, I asked Edward Snowden about the British and GCHQ, and he said that GCHQ is worse than the NSA because the British laws are so broad, you can justify just about anything. When GCHQ says it doesn't break the law, it's because it's almost impossible to break the law. I've read the law twice now and I don't understand it. Even the people who wrote it are struggling with it. It's so ambiguous. Britain is the home of Magna Carta, mother of parliaments, freedom of speech. And something like this makes you realise how fragile it is. You saw again in Citizenfour, the British government said to The Guardian, you've got a choice. We're going to stop your reporting. We're going to close you down. There's going to be a court injunction and you won't be able to report this for 2 years. Or you're going to allow us to come into the building and destroy your computers, hard drives, notebooks, anything that has touched Edward Snowden. And the editor of The Guardian said, what's the point of this? These documents exist in Berlin, they exist in New York, they exist in Rio. It's a purely symbolic gesture. But the editor at the end said, well, if there's a choice of stopping reporting or allowing GCHQ to come in and destroy. But if you told me 3 years ago that the authorities would come into The Guardian or any newspaper office in Western Europe and oversee the destruction of their computers and hard drives, it just shows how fragile things are.
Sherif, avant de passer à la discussion
Sherif,
générale, une question encore sur la possibilité
de
l'asile en Suisse. En réalité, les choses sont assez bloquées. Elles étaient très bloquées jusqu'à présent. Est-ce que vous voyez une possibilité?
But do you see any possibility of that happening?
So I'm slightly embarrassed because my background is in refugees, and I can't quite remember Swiss refugee policy law. But generally speaking, any government in Europe could tomorrow decide that they will give political asylum to Edward Snowden. It's not a problem. Some people have been saying, how would he make it? How would he travel? Any government could issue him a travel document tomorrow. It's an executive decision. Doesn't need very much. I think what will make a difference is if the Swiss government says we will stand by the side of human rights, we will stand by the side of justice. Allow Edward Snowden to come in here, apply for asylum, go through the process and get a fair process, or say, you know what, we don't care about this whole system, we'll just follow what the United States is telling us.
Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, je propose la parole à qui la veut pour des questions à nos invités. Oui. Alors, je crois qu'il y a un micro. Et madame qui est là, si vous voulez attendre le micro, voilà.
Bonsoir, alors je vais briser la glace avec une question tout à fait technique et pratique, parce que ce qui m'a frappé dans l'introduction, c'était une des cibles sera si on utilise un mot de passe compliqué. Si notre mot de passe sort un peu de l'ordinaire, on sera plus ciblé par les investigations.
So I heard that if you had a very unusual password, then the authorities would focus on you even more than if you had a very common one. So I wonder, what's the best thing to do in terms of password? What can I do to try and hide from these spies? Well, I don't think you're at such a risk as Snowden, but anyway, would anyone like to answer that question?
there was, I can't remember if it was in Citizenfour. I think it was in Citizenfour where you saw Snowden gave Glenn his, he asked to see Glenn's laptop, and they handed it back to Glenn and says, type your password in. And Snowden looked totally disappointed when Glenn just went bang, bang, and it looked like sort of 4 or 6 characters. To Snowden, a password is about 64 characters long. And that's just to get you opening the computer. You know, there'll be another 3 levels beyond that. Things like, it's not just passwords. If you use something like Tor, which Snowden advocates and others, and I use it too, you're immediately a subject of suspicion. Tor disguises the location of where you're sending messages from. So they thought, well, that's somebody that's got something to hide. But we should all use encryption. We should all use difficult passwords. We should encrypt our emails. And we should all start using Tor. Because if we all use Tor, it'll no longer be a matter of suspicion.
Oui, Madame là-bas.
Yes, the lady over there.
Oui.
So I just wanted to thank the organization for organizing this. It was a fantastic movie, and Snowden did a fantastic job. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to be a little bit selfish. I actually have 2 questions. The first was, what do you tell people whose response to being surveyed is, at the end of the day, I don't really care. I haven't done anything wrong, so it doesn't really matter. I have nothing to worry about. So that's my first question. And my second question was, what is your opinion in the integration of biometrics in all these platforms like passports, even now with social policies are including them in identification cards and stuff, and I want to know what are the added concerns about including biometrics.
Peut-être Amnesty?
Maybe Amnesty?
Yes, maybe just before, just something on the previous question. You know, there's lots of easy tools now that you can download and you can use for your phone, for your computer, to have much more secure communications. One thing I would recommend, just go to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, look at they have fantastic resources, and we'll point you to some really good applications that are very easy to use as well. But yes, so the first question, you know, on, I think actually, you know, I give an answer maybe that in response to the 2 questions together, but, you know, I think my biggest worry is about looking 20 years into the future. Imagine it's 2035. One thing you're going to hear a lot more about this year and next year is the big thing in technology is probably going to be virtual reality. You're going to hear from Samsung, from Facebook, a company owned by Facebook called Oculus Rift. Lots of other things happening. Microsoft has this separate gadget that they're coming out. Essentially, completely 3-dimensional immersive worlds, first for gaming, but then for meetings, for instead of having a chat over Facebook, by an instant message, you'd be having a face-to-face chat with your friends across the world in a 3D environment, so like this one. In 20 years' time, this will be normal life. This will be, you know, that's kind of the difference between what is digital and what is physical is going to be almost indistinguishable. Imagine what can be done now with everything that's just only the things that we have now being stored and analyzed by computers. Imagine what computer programs 20 years into the future, so much more powerful than they are now, looking at every single thing, literally every single thing you do. You won't be able to escape the internet and see what would be possible. And that's the kind of world you want to live in, especially if some government, without much oversight, decides that they want to use it for not very good reasons.
Probably I may add one historic experience, because this is something I think we should be really pay attention on that. In the communist societies, people had been surveyed very, very much, and people had been really afraid to talk, for example, in a bar openly about politics, and They said always if 3 people are sitting together, one is an informer, and so on. But then they said in the 80s, we don't want to be paralyzed because of this knowledge. We behave as the Stasi didn't exist. We ignore it completely. And we act as we lived in a democracy now. And we do everything openly. And that was, for me, in a way, the key for the peaceful revolution at the end of these dictatorships. So please don't be too much scared about this surveillance, especially pay attention that you are not intimidated of political activities. If that starts, then it's really the end of democracy.
Oui, monsieur.
Yes, the gentleman.
Voilà. Donc, j'aimerais peut-être un peu poursuivre sur le sujet qu'on vient de traiter.
I'd like to keep on
Effectivement,
talking about this issue
ce documentaire traite
documentary
des cas de surveillance dans des pays démocratiques.
talks about surveillance in
Effectivement, les métadonnées sont collectées,
and
mais
all of this
jusqu'à
metadata is
présent,
collected.
on n'a pas constaté trop
until now,
d'usage
we haven't really
abusif
seen it being
contre des gens
used,
normaux, entre guillemets,
against
qui ne représentent
ordinary
pas de
people.
danger particulier.
So it's
Maintenant,
well, I
ça
mean,
se
people who don't
pratique aussi,
represent
on ne l'a
particular
pas dit
danger.
là, dans ce documentaire, malheureusement, mais dans des régimes autoritaires, dans des dictatures,
in totalitarian regimes or dictatorships where the state has actually used such information against citizens to put pressure on them, to threaten them. That's something that has happened. So, Ewen, why isn't the Guardian looking a little bit more closely at what happens in undemocratic countries? Maybe because you don't have someone like Snowden from China or North Korea. But I think that's probably even more dangerous, much more dangerous than what's going on in our countries, at least for the people who are concerned by this.
Ewen.
If I could just add, we saw in Russia recently how opponents are treated as a result of some of this surveillance, particularly related to the Ukraine conflict.
The editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, whenever he's asked this question, says we would love to have a Chinese Snowden or a Russian Snowden, but it's just more difficult for people to come forward from societies like that. Funnily enough, last week The Guardian published stories, we called them the spy cables. They didn't make a lot of news, but myself and a colleague in The Guardian published them. And there were documents, CIA, Mossad, MI6, French, German. But unusually, there were documents there from the Russian FSB. It's the first time I've ever seen them in my life, and we happily published them. But we need an Edward Snowden to come forward in Russia and China. And it's not as ridiculous as it might have seemed once upon a time. You know, because of modern technology, you can get in with a memory stick and download lots of things and send it onwards. There's going to be more Edward Snowdens. Edward Snowden's not the end of it. There's going to be a lot more leakers in the future, and hopefully they'll come from Russia or China.
And therefore, this case is so important. It's really the example of what happens after somebody's acting like that. So it's not only because of our moral responsibility that he gets some asylum. No, he will be the example. If he ends in a very unhappy way, then nobody will follow. But till now, I think he's a good example, and probably other people will follow. And if he ends like Boris Nemtsov ended last weekend, then it would be very sad for our future.
Alors, est-ce que je vois là tout au fond encore peut-être de madame ici?
I recognize the lady here.
Oui.
Oui. Yes, you.
Bonsoir. Ça marche, oui. Oui, je voulais poser une question concernant les.
I had a question
l'intelligence économique.
about economic intelligence. Does the NSA look very carefully at the activities of environmental activists or people who sign petitions or who might be going against the interests of an American company? Do you have any information about that or anything that might be going on in Europe to target environmental activists?
Qui veut répondre à ça?
Who would like to reply? Sherif?
Ou Ewen, comme vous voulez, Sherif?
If you go back and look at the reporting on the that I did with Glenn Greenwald, you'll see that there are documents showing that Greenpeace activists were targeted. And a lot of the documents deal with economic surveillance of companies that are rivals to American companies. And that's a good reason why Europe should be suspicious of the NSA, because the Americans will always help American companies in any given competition. And so the NSA is not just about fighting terrorism and pedophiles and organized crime. It's also about economic competition and promoting American companies. It's about, it suits America. If they send computers by American companies to China or the Middle East or Africa, and they have access to those computers, then that helps the NSA as well. Those stories we did last week on spy cables, one of the documents showed the South Korean government asking the South African government for information about a potentially dangerous individual. That's what the document says. And that potentially dangerous individual is a human rights activist in South Africa who's the head of Greenpeace. He was going to the G20 summit in Seoul, and the South Korean government was asking for information. And he was listed alongside two guys that had been caught up in an Al-Qaeda raid. I'm not anti-intelligence, but they have got out of control, and there's a need for more sort of political and democratic oversight.
We're
coming to the last question. I don't want to frustrate you too much, but I see someone right at the back. I don't see if it's a lady or a gentleman, but I see a hand up. The microphone. Thank you.
I'll speak in English. For the first two questions, actually, it's not a question about learning the tools. You can learn the tools. The internet is out there. It's still free. So you can learn the tools to encrypt. The main thing is what we as people are going to do, how we demand action from our governments, how we demand from whatever governments action towards our rights as users of the internet. So as Edward was saying, there's a lot more happening in just the legislation of our own countries and the legislation of the internet. So I think more than anything, speak about this issue. You know, we're now 1/3 of the whole hall is left. Are we going to speak about the issue, or are we just watching a film? My question, though, is for all three panelists, and mainly is, how is the global scenario now, from your three different perspectives, similar to dystopian novels such as 1984 or others? Are we headed in that direction?
So I'm, well, okay, so I completely agree with everything. You know, I think absolutely, I mean, you know, I think the question of whether we should try to reform the law and the policy, or use better technology, better encryption, I think it's the wrong question. I think it's both. But at the same time, as long as the capability is there, as long as the technology is there, and it's there, it's just going to get better. It's probably got better since Edward Snowden was at the NSA. They probably have more capability now, spying on even more people. Then, you know, I don't believe for a second that intelligence agencies, in the way that they work, in the way that current states look at intelligence as such a secretive part of the state, I don't believe for a second that any law we put on the books is going to really make a difference. In a sense, yes, it will make a difference for traditional law enforcement. It will make a difference for having your local counsel not try to find out whether you are trying to get benefits while you're not entitled to them, or whether you're, you know, applying for the wrong school or something. that would make a difference to that. But for the very secretive parts of the government, the intelligence services, I think if the capacity is there, it's going to be used. And so that's why I think the technology side of it is extremely important. The things that what Edward Snowden, what many others are doing in trying to create better and more secure technologies is extremely important, and we need to educate ourselves. But I do think that this dystopian future in 1984 is, it could, I mean, it's not only that it could happen, but I mean, we are at the beginning of the path for it. If things don't change, I think in the next few years, then that will become accepted. Then we will live in 1984. It will just be 2034 instead.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous arrivons au terme. On demandera, Hubertus, un petit mot d'abord le regard de l'historien.
A word from a historian's perspective. What has Snowden changed?
He has started a big debate about these problems, and he made it obvious for everybody of us that there's something happening which shouldn't happen. So I'm not so pessimistic as you are, because I see already that the results of this debate and of his activities. And I think that the intelligence services are really, at the moment, also very cautious. What can they do? For example, none of these tapped phone calls had been published. You could use them very easily to all kind of political goals. The only one which was published probably by the Russian secret police. It was a phone call between the head of the EU department or European department in the Foreign Office in the United States and the American ambassador, where this lady said, "Fuck the EU." It was published by somebody, but not from the Americans, that's for sure. And the second case was when obviously the government of North Korea took all the emails of Sony Pictures because they were against this new movie, The Interview. So we know two cases what you can do with this information, but we see that on the Western side, this misuse of this information didn't happen yet, and thankfully it didn't happen yet, because I think they are a little bit afraid. If the debate gets stronger, then you can also cancel all these activities. It needs only a decision of the American Congress to stop them. It's very easy. And we do the same in Germany now. There's a commission and the parliament, and they can stop these activities if they exaggerate these activities. So they had to be cautious, and it's very important now that all of us, we try to organize this political power to put these methods of surveillance under the control of the democratic elected institutions of our societies.
Merci.
Thank you, and we also need to thank Isabel Gatica, the director of the festival, and so many others who've given us the opportunity to be here tonight at this extraordinary discussion. I know that you speak French, Sherif. You shouldn't have given that away, but I'd like you just to talk a little bit in French about the moving aspect of all of this. Amnesty defends so many anonymous people, and here we have such a well-known person now throughout the world, and yet such a genuine person. What does it mean for you to defend someone like that? Okay, well, I'll try and speak a little bit of French. And maybe just go back to English in a moment. But what I wanted to say, to come back to the future, this issue of transparency.
Things that we need, so that's not everything if everything stays secret and unaccountable, then we'll end up in the dystopian future. If we have transparency and accountability, then there's hope for something better. Snowden. Je crois que, Edward Snowden, pour moi, c'est quelqu'un
for me, Edward Snowden is someone who sacrificed so much to show up what the NSA and GCHQ are doing. So I think really he's a hero in that respect. This was a real heroic act, and it's something that's so important for human rights at the global level, not just in the United States or in Europe, but all around the world. And I think it's vital that as citizens, members of the public, we show that we support him, and we ask our governments and demand, we ask our governments to give him asylum, to help him travel, for instance, just to come to Switzerland, to submit an asylum claim so that he can be protected. As Amnesty International, we support Snowden, and we will be continuing to support him even more in the future. And I really hope that many of you do so as well. Yes, I'm sure that you could advocate on his behalf. You could have a referendum. Thank you very much, and a round of applause for the festival. Thank you very much.